May 19th, 1945. Augsburg, Bavaria. The rifles had been stacked for 11 days. Inside a sprawling American POW camp on the city's eastern edge, 4,000 German prisoners moved through their days in a kind of suspended limbo, eating, sleeping, waiting to be processed and sent home to whatever was left of home. The tents were crowded but standing. The food was plain but regular. Guards walked the perimeter in boots that were still whole, which was more than most of these men could say about their own. The camp ran on routine: morning roll call, meals at fixed hours, lights out at 9. The Americans were efficient about it, not cruel, not warm, just methodical in the way that armies are when they've won and the paperwork still needs to get done. Two kinds of men lived inside that wire. From the outside, in the gray light of a Bavarian spring, you might not have noticed the difference. Both groups wore the remnants of German uniforms. Both were unshaved. Both had the particular hollowness behind the eyes that comes from years of war and weeks of collapse. But the difference was real, and everyone inside the camp felt it. The first group was Wehrmacht, the regular German army. Infantrymen, mostly. Some tankers, some artillerymen, a handful of engineers. The majority had been conscripted in their late teens or early 20s, handed a rifle, and pointed east or west, depending on the year. They had not volunteered for this war. They had inherited it the way a man inherits debt, without being asked and without a clear way out. The second group was smaller, a few hundred men, officers in the main, captured in the final weeks as the Reich's Western Front simply dissolved. They were Waffen-SS. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The SS had always been set apart, by design and by choice. They were volunteers, every one of them. Joining the SS was an act of belief, a declaration that you accepted the ideology completely, not just as policy, but as identity. Their uniforms were different: black dress tunics with silver death's head insignia for the General SS, camouflage field gear for the Waffen combat divisions, but always with the twin lightning bolts on the collar that told everyone exactly what they were. Their training was harder. Their rations during the early war years were better. Their equipment was prioritized. When supplies were short, the Wehrmacht waited. The SS generally did not. For 6 years, that separation had been structural and absolute. SS officers did not socialize with Wehrmacht enlisted men. They did not eat at the same tables when it could be avoided. They occupied a different layer of the German military world, one that sat above the regular army in ideology, if not always in formal rank.
Wehrmacht soldiers resented it. Many of them privately despised the SS. For the arrogance, yes, but more specifically for what the SS had done in the East, in the occupied territories, in the camps. The Wehrmacht had its own crimes, and historians have documented them carefully. But the SS had made atrocity into policy, and the ordinary German soldier knew it, even if he never said it out loud. By May of 1945, that silence had curdled into something harder. The Wehrmacht men in the Augsburg camp had watched the Reich collapse. They had seen the last offensives fail, seen the fuel run out, seen boys of 15 handed Panzerfausts and told to stop American armor. They blamed the SS partly for the fanaticism that had dragged the war 6 months past any rational endpoint. SS commanders had shot deserters. SS units had executed German soldiers who tried to surrender. The war had gone on longer than it needed to because men in black uniforms had made surrender a death sentence. Now those same men were sitting on cots 20 feet away, and they were still acting like they were in charge. The Americans, for their part, had organized the camp practically. Officers in one section, enlisted in another. Standard Geneva Convention procedure, applied without particular regard for which German organization a man belonged to. Inside the officer tents, Wehrmacht majors and SS majors ended up on adjacent cots. The SS did not like this.
They did not say so immediately. For the first 3 nights, they managed it by simply taking the better cots, the ones near the tent entrance where there was more air, and leaving the interior positions to the Wehrmacht men. The old hierarchy, enforced through habit rather than orders. On the 4th night, an SS Obersturmbannführer, a lieutenant colonel, named Werner Baumann decided that habit was not enough. The tent was too close, the air too stale, the proximity to men he considered beneath him too constant. He gathered 7 other SS officers that evening, and they drafted a formal request, addressed to the camp commandant. The document was careful. It cited Article 17 of the Geneva Convention, which mandated that officer prisoners be housed separately from enlisted men. It used the language of military tradition and professional standards. It argued in measured terms that mixed housing arrangements undermined discipline and were contrary to the customs of all modern armies. What it was actually saying required no translation. The SS officers did not want to sleep next to soldiers they had spent 6 years treating as subordinates. The request reached Colonel Albert Morrison, the camp commandant, the following morning. Morrison was a practical man, a former logistics officer from Ohio, who had spent the war moving supplies and had developed a sharp eye for problems before they became larger ones. He read the document twice. Then he set it on his desk and looked at it for a while. He could have denied it in 30 seconds. The Geneva Convention article the SS officer cited applied to the separation of officers from enlisted men, which the camp already observed. It said nothing about separating officers of one organization from officers of another. The request had no legal foundation. But Morrison did not deny it immediately. Something about the document bothered him in a way that went past administrative annoyance. These men had lost. Their country had surrendered unconditionally. They were sitting in an American camp eating American food, and they were still writing formal requests for better treatment based on their status in an army that no longer existed, serving a government that had ceased to function, defending a hierarchy that had just overseen the deaths of tens of millions of people. He forwarded it to Division headquarters with a brief cover note. Division sent it to 3rd Army. It reached General George Patton on the afternoon of May 21st. Patton had been dealing with the occupation for weeks by then, and the administrative problems of the SS were not new to him. He had visited Ohrdruf on April 12th, one of the first American generals to walk through a concentration camp. He had seen what the SS had built and maintained and run. He had gone outside afterward and been sick. He had then called every German civilian within walking distance and made them come inside and see it too. His feelings about the SS were not complicated. He read the request in his office, standing. His chief of staff watched him finish it, set it down, and pick up the telephone. Morrison answered on the second ring. The SS officers who sent this, how many signed it? 8 signed it, sir, but I'd estimate 30 or 40 support it, possibly more. And the Wehrmacht man in the camp? What's the mood between the two groups? Morrison considered the question. Bad, sir. The Wehrmacht men blame the SS for prolonging the war. There have been no incidents, but the tension is there. Patton was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was deciding something rather than hesitating. How many Wehrmacht officers are in the camp? Approximately 300, sir. Here is what you're going to do. Take every SS officer in that camp, every one. Put them in a single tent, the largest one you have, and move that tent to the center of the Wehrmacht section, surrounded on all sides by regular army officers. Morrison processed this. Yes, sir. And before you move them, let the Wehrmacht officers know who requested special treatment. Tell them exactly what the SS men wrote, that they didn't want to share quarters with common soldiers. Understood, sir. Make sure the tent is full. I don't want anyone comfortable in there. Morrison confirmed it, and the call ended.
That evening, American guards moved through the SS quarters, reading names from a clipboard. The officers were told to collect their belongings. The assumption among the SS men was immediate and uniform. The Americans had reviewed the request, found it reasonable, and were now relocating them to separate, appropriate quarters. Several men packed with something approaching satisfaction. One was overheard saying that it had simply been a matter of citing the correct regulation. They were walked across the camp in a loose column, past the rows of standard tents, into the Wehrmacht section. They stopped in front of a large tent that had been erected that afternoon. It was meant to hold 30 men comfortably. The guards had put 80 cots inside. Baumann looked at the tent, then at the guard escorting him. This cannot be correct. The guard checked his clipboard. 80 SS officers, this tent. That's correct. We submitted a request for separate quarters. You got separate quarters. You're separated from everyone else. Just SS in there like you wanted. The column filed inside. There was barely room to stand between the cots. Men had to turn sideways to move down the rows. The canvas walls absorbed the heat of the evening and gave none of it back. Baumann found a cot near the center. There were no good positions in this tent, and sat down. Outside, the Wehrmacht officers had gathered. Word had already spread, passed tent to tent through the camp in the hour before the move.
The SS had written a formal request saying they were too good to share quarters with regular soldiers. The Americans had responded by cramming them all into one tent and parking it in the middle of the Wehrmacht section. The Wehrmacht men did not attack. The American guards were positioned and watching. But standing in a loose ring around the tent in the early evening light, watching the SS officers file in and disappear behind the canvas, that was enough. Some of them said nothing. Some laughed. A few said things, not loudly, in the direction of the tent, that did not require a response, because no response was possible. That first night was not restful for anyone in that tent. 80 men in a space built for 30 meant that the air went stale within an hour of lights out. The canvas held the day's heat through midnight. Men lay on their sides to fit, shoulders touching the men beside them. Outside, they could hear the Wehrmacht officers in adjacent tents, voices carrying in the night air, the occasional laughter. Baumann lay on his cot in the dark and understood, with complete clarity, what had just happened. This was not accommodation. The Americans had taken their request, read it carefully, and used it against them. Every word they had written in that document, the citations, the formal language, the careful argument about military tradition, had been turned into the architecture of their punishment. They had asked to be separated from soldiers they considered beneath them. They had been separated, completely, from everyone. Patton arrived the following morning at 8:30. He came without ceremony, the way he usually inspected things he actually wanted to see rather than things he wanted to be seen inspecting. A jeep, 2 aides, Morrison meeting him at the gate. He walked the main rows first, checked the food distribution line, asked a sergeant about the water supply, looked at the medical tent without going in. Standard commander's inspection, unhurried, methodical. Then they turned toward the Wehrmacht section. The large tent was visible from 50 yards, conspicuous by its size and by the ring of space that had opened around it. The Wehrmacht officers in the neighboring tents had migrated, subtly, away from it. Not far, just enough to mark a boundary. Some sat on the ground outside their own tents watching. A few stood. Nobody was making noise, exactly. The watching was enough. Morrison nodded toward the tent. "That's them, sir. All 81. Patton looked at it for a moment without moving. Then, bring out whoever wrote the request. It took the guards 3 minutes to locate Baumann and walk him out. He came through the tent flap into the morning light looking like a man who had not slept and had spent the sleepless hours trying to decide how to carry himself when morning came. He had made some effort. His collar was straightened. His bearing was correct. But his eyes were red, and the night was written in his face.
He stopped in front of Patton and came to attention. Patton looked at him the way a man looks at something he is trying to accurately assess rather than something that has surprised him. "You wrote the request?" "Yes, sir. Obersturmbannführer Werner Baumann, Waffen-SS, 2nd Panzer Division." Patton let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke again. "You cited the Geneva Convention." "We believed we had grounds, sir. The convention is clear regarding the separation of officer prisoners from enlisted men." "The convention separates officers from enlisted men. You are in a tent with officers, German officers, specifically the ones you requested not to sleep near." Baumann said nothing. "You wrote that mixed housing arrangements were contrary to the customs of all modern armies." Patton's voice was even, which was in its own way worse than anger. "Which modern army were you referring to? The one that surrendered 9 days ago?" A few of the Wehrmacht officers watching had moved closer, not obviously, just close enough. Patton continued, "The men in those tents around you, the ones you decided were beneath you, most of them were conscripted, handed a uniform and a rifle and told to fight a war they had no say in starting. Some of them have been in the field since 1941. They bled in the same mud you bled in. They lost the same war you lost. The difference is they did not choose it, and you did." He paused, and when he continued, his voice stayed level.
"You volunteered. Every man in that tent volunteered. You chose the uniform with the insignia on the collar. You chose the organization. You chose what it stood for. And now you are asking for special treatment because you do not want to sleep near men who simply fought for their country without choosing to belong to something that went considerably further than that." Baumann's jaw tightened, but he did not respond. There was no response available that would not make things worse, and he was intelligent enough to know it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more stories like this one. Patton looked past Baumann at the tent, then at the Wehrmacht officers watching from the perimeter. You wanted to be separate. You are separate. You will stay separate until you are processed and released. All 81 of you in there, and all the room you asked for. He turned to Morrison. How long until they're processed? 4 to 6 weeks for the full camp, sir. The SS will likely go later rather than earlier. Denazification screening takes longer. Patton nodded. Then they have time to get used to it. He said nothing further to Baumann. The man was dismissed with a look rather than a word, sent back through the tent flap into the heat and the closeness, and the 80 other men who had all in their different ways spent the night arriving at the same understanding.
The inspection moved on. Patton spent another 40 minutes in the camp, looked at the latrine facilities, spoke briefly with the mess officer, asked Morrison about the processing timeline for the Wehrmacht enlisted men. Ordinary administrative conversation. He did not mention the tent again. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. That is worth saying plainly, because the temptation in telling a story like this is to suggest that something broke open, that the SS officers emerged from the experience transformed, humbled into honesty, converted by discomfort into different men. Some of them were. Most were not, or not entirely, or not in ways that lasted. What the tent did was remove a buffer. For 6 years, the SS had operated inside a structure that confirmed their own account of themselves. The uniform confirmed it. The better rations confirmed it. The deference they received from Wehrmacht personnel confirmed it, even when that deference was coerced rather than freely given. The argument was the argument, and the argument was everywhere, all the time, inescapable. In the tent, none of that existed. The cots were identical. The rations were identical. The Americans addressed them by name or by the German rank they'd held, with no particular reverence for either. The Wehrmacht officers watching from outside were not deferring. The American guards were not impressed. The war was over, and the structure that had carried the SS argument was gone, and what remained was 81 men in a canvas tent that was too hot and too small, waiting to go home.
Some of them began talking to the Wehrmacht officers in the surrounding tents, carefully at first, in the neutral language of men who share a situation without sharing much else. Then, in a few cases, with something closer to honesty. A Waffen-SS captain named Friedrich Gerber, who had commanded a unit on the Western Front from 1943 onward, later recalled in a post-war memoir that the 6 weeks in Augsburg had been the first time he had spoken at length with Wehrmacht officers as peers, rather than subordinates. He wrote that the conversations had not been comfortable, and that he had not expected them to be. Others stayed sealed. They processed the experience as injustice, American mistreatment of POWs, deliberate cruelty disguised as procedure. A few constructed elaborate private arguments about why the Geneva Convention had been violated. They went home carrying the same structure they'd arrived with, its foundations already cracked but still holding, at least from the inside. Baumann was released in late July of 1945 after denazification screening. He returned to Hamburg, where his family had lived before the war. What he found there is not recorded in any document that survived. Hamburg had been bombed heavily. The 1943 firestorm operation alone had killed approximately 37,000 civilians in a single week. Whatever Baumann had imagined he was going back to had not waited for him.
His post-war life is not documented in the sources that cover this period. He disappears from the record after his release processing. That is not unusual. Millions of Germans disappeared from the record in 1945 into the ordinary work of rebuilding lives in a country that no longer resembled the one they had served. Patton did not record the incident in his diary or in his correspondence. This is also not unusual. The occupation generated administrative decisions by the hundreds each week, and Patton was managing a territory, a drawdown, a denazification process, and his own increasingly complicated relationships with Allied command. One tent arrangement in one camp in Augsburg was not the kind of thing that made it into his papers. What he was thinking about in May and June of 1945 was larger and more troubling than POW housing. He had toured the concentration camps. He had overseen the forced marches of German civilians through Ohrdruf. He had written to his wife that he had never in his life felt what he felt walking through those places.
He was also growing increasingly frustrated with Soviet behavior in the occupation zones, increasingly convinced that the post-war arrangement was being mishandled, increasingly vocal about it in ways that would eventually cost him his command. The SS tent in Augsburg was a footnote to all of that, a practical decision made in 20 seconds on a telephone call, designed to solve a specific administrative problem by turning its own logic back on itself.
That it worked as more than administration, that it became for the men inside it something they carried home, was not something Patton planned for. He was not in the business of rehabilitation. He was in the business of running an occupation zone and getting 4,000 German prisoners processed and released without incident. The lesson, if there was one, arrived sideways and without announcement, the way most real lessons do. The SS officers had built their identity on separation, from the enemy, from the Wehrmacht, from the ordinary soldiers they commanded. They had maintained that separation through 6 years of war with a consistency that required constant institutional reinforcement. Take away the institution, put 81 men in a tent that is too small for the purpose, surround them with the men they had separated themselves from, and the separation becomes the punishment. They had asked for exactly what they received. That was the particular precision of it. The Wehrmacht soldiers in that camp were home by autumn. Most returned to ruined cities and fractured families, and the long, unglamorous work of denazification and reconstruction. West Germany would spend the next 2 decades in a complicated and often incomplete reckoning with what the war had been and what had been done in its name. Some of the men from that camp participated in that reckoning. Some avoided it. The historical record does not follow individual privates and sergeants home from POW camps with much consistency. The SS officers took longer to release, as Morrison had predicted. Denazification screening for SS personnel required documentation, interrogation, cross-referencing with captured German records. Some were held into 1946. A handful faced war crimes proceedings. Most were eventually released into the same ruined country and the same uncertain future. The tent in Augsburg came down sometime in the summer of 1945, folded and loaded onto a truck with the rest of the camp equipment as the prisoner population decreased and the facility wound down. There is no marker there now. The city rebuilt itself, as German cities did, and the campsite was absorbed into the post-war landscape without ceremony. What remains is the logic of what happened inside it. An organization that had defined itself by its separateness from ordinary men, asked in defeat to be kept separate from ordinary men. The request was granted in the most literal possible way, and in the granting it became something else entirely, a mirror held up at close range, in a tent that was too hot and too crowded, in front of soldiers who had once obeyed and now simply watched. The SS had spent 6 years insisting they were different from everyone around them. In Augsburg, for 6 weeks, they found out what that actually felt like. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.